Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Ritacco, NACo's Chief Government Affairs Officer, and I am ready to share with you an update on federal policy on some late-breaking news we have today about the Omnibus Appropriations Bill being considered in the House of Representatives today. I want to give just 5 or 10 seconds to let everyone filter into the room here. I see the numbers growing, so I'll just give it a couple seconds before we start. But thank you again for joining us on late notice. It's been a day full of news about the Omnibus Appropriations Bill in the House of Representatives, which will eventually, of course, need to be passed by the Senate before becoming law when government funding is scheduled to run out later this week. So let's update on where we are. This week and across the last several months, Congress has been attempting to finalize the 2022 fiscal year 2022 appropriations process, which, as you know, funds the government for that fiscal year. And you'll see throughout this presentation, we've had a lot of late breaking information. Some of you might even have one eye on Speaker Pelosi's press conference, which I believe just concluded. And I'm sorry, I am less of a draw than her, I'm sure. So if you need to watch hers, by all means do so. But otherwise, I'll give you my reading of what is going on here. So Congress has been working to finalize an omnibus appropriations package. It's a $1.5 trillion package that they hope to pass today and send to the Senate before government funding runs out at the end of this week. So in the event that the House and Senate can't pass a bill and have it signed by the president, there'll be a short-term extension of that funding called the continuing resolution. But the expectation is that an omnibus appropriations bill will eventually pass both houses of Congress. So the top line numbers are that there's $42 billion increase over last year in defense spending and a $46 billion increase in non-defense spending. And the key and the driver of the action that's happening today is around a supplemental appropriations package on COVID relief and an appropriations package for aid to Ukraine. Both are supplemental appropriations, so they're outside of the normal appropriations process. So this is going to be a very brief call because this, while this is a really big deal in terms of solidifying 2022 omnibus spending, the reason for this call was partially predicated on this COVID relief funding here that you see that I've crossed out, and more on that in a moment. When this bill eventually passes, we'll have follow-up webinars about what these investments mean for counties and how counties can access those funding, those pots of money. So in the text that we received last night, and I'll walk you through kind of the sort of behind the scenes and sausage making of how we arrived at text last night, but let's take the text for what it is. The text that was released late last night includes an increase in funding for rural development housing programs, renewable energy development, a decrease of $170 million in funding for the Community Development Block Grant Program, which is something that we have our eye on because that is such an important program to counties. An additional $840 million for capitalization grants under the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and Clean Water State Revolving Fund, $75 billion for election security grants, $200 million in new and flexible funding for CDC, $100 million for the Mental Health Block Grant, $583 million in additional funding for the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infant, and Children. It's called WIC. $289 million for Head Start, $674 million for Burn Jag. And these are, this is a huge bill. So I'm just highlighting the key programs that are important to our counties and our county partners. So this bill also increases FEMA's public assistance program, the federal cost share of which from 75% to 90%. And very importantly, for so many of our counties, especially in the western part of the United States, provides 1 year of full mandatory funding for the payment in lieu of taxes program. $5.7 billion for the U.S. Forest Service targeted towards hazardous fuel treatments and increased staff capacities, $550 million to expand broadband internet access in underserved areas, almost $100 billion for DOT. And this funding is really important because if you had joined us in the last call, we talked about how harmful a continuing resolution was between the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law in November and now. Under that continuing resolution, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law's new programs would not be able to be fully funded and jump-started without new funding. So this omnibus bill would do that. There's also $1.3 billion in earmarks, or what used to be called earmarks, for highways, roads, bridges, airports, and public transit systems. These projects are specifically detailed in the law. So, we will build a bridge at XY county in XY state. This is new. Earmarks, as you all know, have been not used by Congress for the last 11 years or so. So this is the first appropriations bill that has these earmarks. They're called community funded projects or community projects in the bill, but these are what used to be called earmarks, and they're very specific projects in very specific places. So there are many projects in the bill that are county-owned infrastructure. So let's talk for a moment about what this call could have been about, and that was about another provision in this omnibus that we saw last night that was removed in the last hour or so. So I'm going to kind of take you through the timeline of what occurred over the last 24 hours, but I want to leave you with that this is just letting you all know how we got to the place that we're at now and sort of what could have been. So the headline of which is that the administration, in addition to all the funding that we talked about here, the Biden administration wanted additional funding for COVID mitigation. And so the additional funding, it was $15 billion for additional COVID response, is considered a supplemental. In order to offset the cost of that additional COVID funding, there was a proposal to offset it with unused ARP money, and half of the offset, so half of the $15 billion, roughly half of the $15 billion, out of the state and local fiscal recovery fund, which, as you know, who've been on webinars with us, over the years, rescinding that program, even to pay for worthy activities like COVID relief, would be incredibly problematic. So that's the headline, that there was $15 billion for COVID relief that would be partially offset with rescinding funding from the state and local recovery fund. But in the last 90 minutes or so, that provision has been pulled from the bill. So everything I just said that was in the bill remains in the bill. Everything I'm about to preview for you or sort of take you behind the scenes with is not in the bill anymore. And I want to walk you through that to know what might have happened and what we might want to look for in the future when future pieces of legislation come out. So up until an hour ago or so, about 90 minutes or so, this is what was in the bill: a $15 billion clawback of ARPA money to pay for additional COVID activities. The way that the bill was written, states would see their funds rescinded, but counties never would. And I will say that Speaker Pelosi was very clear about not wanting to claw back any local money. And so the way the bill was written was a bit clunky and complicated, but the end result of this provision, which again has been removed, would be that states would have money rescinded in order to pay for additional COVID activity. And so, again, the way this was written, and it has since been removed, is that there would be sort of a flow down system or a flow down scheme, I guess, where unused money would first be rescinded from the states, and then rescinded from the territories and tribes, and then rescinded from local governments. So counties were the last option to have funds rescinded. And I'm sharing this structure for you because just because it was removed from this bill does not mean that it will never appear again in future pieces of legislation. So it's important that we continue to tell the story of the American Recovery, the American Rescue Plan Act's enormous benefit on our communities, because you all should know that were it not for the leadership of the administration, Speaker Pelosi, Senator Schumer, and others, that some of this money could be rescinded. And it's clear that there is an appetite by some in Congress to use these funds, these recovery funds, as an offset. And doing so would be very harmful, not only to the investments that we're making, the planning that we're doing, but would also be harmful to the intergovernmental partnership. This money was promised to local governments and state governments. Local governments especially are obligating these funds quickly. They're making investments, they're planning for the future. They're fully expecting to receive their second tranche payment on May 10th, 2022. And so, again, the headline is there is no change to the recovery fund program. But I think it's important for the people on this call to know how close we got to potentially having to deal with the situation where Congress was using unobligated recovery fund dollars to pay for other activities. And again, is the reason why I would very much encourage you all to wisely, expeditiously plan to spend, to invest your funds, to diligently report on how you're spending these funds in order for us to tell the story of the great investments that counties are making using these recovery funds. May 10th is a really important date. That's when Treasury is going to send out the second tranche of payments to counties. And on that date, it will become a lot harder for any future Congress or any future action by this Congress to rescind that money. So this is very much a quick update for you all. I can answer a couple of questions if there are any, but that's where we are. We expect the omnibus to pass at some point this weekend. There are procedural clocks that need to elapse in order for that to occur. The House needs to pass this bill. The action of stripping out the COVID money necessitates additional procedural steps. The bill needs to go back to the Rules Committee. There is a customary 1 hour period in which the minority in the House is able to read the bill before it can be before the Rules Committee can have a hearing on it. Once that occurs, there's 5 hours of floor time. So we are well into the evening tonight, which pushes all the clocks back into what seems like a sort of early Saturday, very late Friday night situation. So one question in the chat, and the only question so far, which means I'm doing either a really bad or a really good job, because usually there's just a stream of questions, is where are these earmarks available? And so they are included in the text of the bill. There's an explanatory statement that is easily available, and perhaps one of my great colleagues can go put that in the chat while I'm talking. And you can find it there. It's listed as a table. It'll list the project, where the project is, the amount, who requested it, and so on and so forth. Answering a few other questions in the chat. Are any of these funds direct aid to local governments? Program by program, we will break those down for you. The text of this bill came out after midnight last night, and the great staff here at NACo has already identified key programs, but the granular details about how exactly counties access the funding is something that we will work on. Speaking of accessing funding, though, let me put in a plug for the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which again, the activities of which are funded through this omnibus, so it's all kind of connected. That Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which was passed in November, has lots of direct to county money. And we have a resource that hopefully can find its way to the chat where you can identify each program in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and how you can access those funds. And why am I talking about it on this call? Because this omnibus appropriations bill will fill up the coffers of those programs so that funding that will eventually go direct to counties will be available. And I hope that makes sense. Another question in the chat is, how can these funds be rescinded if they are already obligated? That's the trick, is that they're not already obligated. They're, as the way that the law was written, as you'll recall, there was 2 tranches of payments. Counties received half their money in May of 2021, or whenever you applied for the funding from May onward. And then the other half would be given a year later. In Treasury's final rule, they said, okay, instead of doing that year gap, all the second tranche payments are going to be given on May 10th, 2022. So how can money be rescinded if it's already obligated? It's already obligated by Congress in that they passed a law to do it, but it hasn't been given directly to those recipients yet. Another question in the chat is, any intel on members of Congress that were wanting to rescind these funds? No, not specific members of Congress. I think there's public reporting that would indicate what groups of people were requiring the offset, and that's really an important question. It's, why did we get to a place of needing to rescind? The answer to that is that the administration requested an additional $15 billion in COVID relief, and then some in Congress said, well, in order to get that $15 billion, we have to offset it from somewhere else. And so those who were making the demand to offset it for somewhere else arrived at these funds as a way to offset them. But again, these are state funds, not county funds. So there was no iteration really where county funds would be rescinded, but that doesn't mean that some future iteration or some future piece of legislation there wouldn't be that wouldn't occur. So I really did show you how we got here as a bit of a cautionary tale on how close we came to having sort of the disastrous situation of counties who are planning for, obligating in a different way, obligating these funds, committing these funds, voting on these funds in their counties, all to have it yanked away at the last moment. Question in the chat, if something like the clawback were to occur in the future, would they only target non-obligated funds? Basically, would they go after obligated funds or funding that they haven't yet given to the county? And we were talking about this morning. There's really no way to take back funding that has already been given to counties. So the only really a pot of available clawbackable money would be that second tranche payment, which is set to go out on May 10th. Question in the chat, with the state funds being removed, it will impact our counties, won't it? Our budget reconciliation process as we speak. Yes, absolutely. So not only the question is, well, if states are getting clawback, of course that will affect the ecosystem of the fiscal ecosystem in every state, without a question. So that's why we were, very wary of any clawbacks at all to this program, regardless of whether counties were going to be directly impacted or not. Both from an intergovernmental partnership principle and a real world effect of how this sudden fiscal shock would affect counties in different states. And lastly, one of the many reasons that we were extremely opposed to even states or whoever any changes to this program, to the Recovery Fund program, is exactly related to what you see in the chat right now, is that counties have already entered into contracts contingent upon this second tranche of money. So pulling that money back would not only be a breach of the sort of principle of intergovernmental partnership, it would be an actual breach of the contracts that counties are currently engaged in. So we need to be on high alert, at least until May 10th, and maybe even into the future, about this issue that these funds are seen falsely as kind of funds that are in the ether and available to be clawed back, because as the commenter in the chat points out, they're really not. County commissions, county boards, county executives are obligating these funds as we speak. And Treasury has given us the permission and in fact encouraged us to do that. And so, again, we crisis averted this time, but we do want to be looking out for that in the future. And I also don't want to lose sight of the fact that this omnibus appropriations bill has many county priorities. So would we have had this urgent kind of call had we known that this provision was being removed? No, probably not. But since we're here, it's really important to talk about this another round of really robust investment in local governments. So last question in the chat, they're related, and this will be the last one. The question is basically like, well, should we wait until May 10th or should we continue to obligate funds, or should we wait to see if what Congress does? I think it would be wise to continue on the path that you've been on for the last year, which is to wisely invest these funds in worthy causes that are compliant with the final rule. Nothing in this bill will change that. The May 10th is an operative date because in Treasury's final rule released in January, they said that they're going to make that second tranche payment on May 10th. I don't foresee that changing. That would require a sort of an extraordinary act of regulatory change. So it's already in the final rule. Congress would have to sort of proactively change that, and changing that would not actually solve the problem that they were trying to solve here. So all that being said, continue to make wise investments in your community. Tell us your stories. We have a whole database of really exciting, innovative investments that are being made that are changing communities across the country. And we're taking those stories and we're telling our federal partners, this is what these funds are doing. And, doing so is, of course, good for the country. It's good for our residents, but it's also good to guard against those who think that these funds are a piggy bank for other activities, because we know that they're not. So I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. The virtual door is always open to me and my staff. My email is mritacco@naco.org. Email me anytime. Email our staff anytime. Erin Hurley is listening in. She is our guru on the technical aspects of this fund. She is living and breathing these funds every day. Taryn Zamuda, our chief economist, is working with Erin to tell the story of these funds. And this is something that we're doing every day, telling those investment stories, and we need your help to do it. So I again implore you to look to our resources, tell us your story, and help us help you protect these funds as much as possible. So thank you all again, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.